Hi, I'm Jim Jones, and I served in the United States Navy about 3.5 years on active duty and about 12.5 years in reserve status. I was in a program called the Reserve Officer Candidate Program. And what that amounted to was that I was at Berkeley and I did my first stint of officer candidate school back in Newport, Rhode Island in the summer between my sophomore and junior year, and then I did the second half of officer candidate school between my junior and senior year, and then when I graduated, I went on active duty. They lost me, however, in that I graduated in January, a semester early, and thought that they would just pick me up, but they weren't programmed to pick me up until I was programmed to graduate at the end of June. So for about 4 months, I was just kind of a lost little boy calling the Bureau of Personnel, trying to figure out where I was supposed to go. And finally, this was in the spring of 1961, they decided that they would send me someplace. So on about 3 days' notice, I had to get all my uniforms because officers have to buy their own uniforms, have them fitted, all that sort of thing, all the insignia of rank put on them and whatnot. I had 3 days to do all that and be on a ship in San Diego. I soon became assigned as the ship's gunnery officer, which led to my having hearing aids today from standing next to those anti-aircraft cannons. It was a very interesting job in many ways because one of our duties was as amphibious boat wave officers. And that meant that we would go out into the water in those small landing craft. You've seen them in World War II movies, that the ramp drops down and all the Marines charge out. And this ship was literally covered with these landing craft, some big, some little. The small ones carried 32 men, fully combat equipped, plus 3 crew. And I can recall I hadn't been on the ship more than about a week. It was a quiet evening in San Diego before we shipped out to go to the Western Pacific. And I remember talking to an old warrant boatswain. Now, warrant officers are a very special sort of people in the armed forces. They're the old-timers who've been around. They usually served a long time as enlisted men. They really know what they're doing, and they get commissioned in this special grade of warrant officer. And being a boatswain, that means he was in charge of sort of running the ship and also taking care of all the ship's boats, of which we had over 30. And as I say, they were just crammed everywhere. So on this quiet evening when I happened to be off work, I said, "Gee, Boats." He asked me if I had any questions. I said, "Yeah," I said, "I do have one question." I said, "We have 35 officers on this ship, and 21 of us are ensigns." That's like a second lieutenant in the Army. I said, "That's more ensigns than I've seen in one place at one time outside the Naval Academy." I said, "I just thought that was kind of odd." And he started laughing, and I said, "What's so funny?" He said, "Son, do you see all these boats?" I mean, like we're standing in the midst of them, they're towering over us. You can't get away from them. And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "What do you suppose those boats do?" And I said, "Well, take troops to the beach." He said, "Pretty intelligent." He says, "Under what kind of conditions do you think that those boats take the combat-loaded troops to the beach?" I said, "Combat?" I said, "Bingo." And he said, "Son, how do you think those boats get to the beach?" I said, "Oh." He said, "If the war starts, you've got a lifespan of 17 seconds. And he laughed heartily. One of the things that is useful if when you show this program, any young people are watching it, they would wonder, what's the life of a junior officer like, perhaps, in the Navy. And our work day was 14 hours. 14 hours, 6 days a week, except on Sunday when it was only 10 hours. And when you're at sea for 6-8 weeks, that can get to be quite a routine, because you have an 8-hour job, whatever it might be, gunnery officer, personnel officer, you name it, plus you would be standing 6 hours of watches in 4-hour stints, and that meant that your sleep cycle was constantly being rotated, so that when you had, if you had the watch from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. tonight, tomorrow night you'd have it from probably 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. and then you'd have another watch 8 hours after that. So it was constantly drifting around. I remember once we were doing amphibious exercises in which we had to simulate approaching a beach. We'd had some difficulty in our squadron with compass navigation at night and in fog. And so we were being carefully drilled in that. And rather than go into the beach, which is a big operation, you have to touch down on the beach, and it can get dangerous if you're not careful. We wanted to do a series of exercises in the open ocean, so to speak. We were off of the Sugbu Beach in Okinawa, and there's a huge bay there, and the water's relatively calm. And in a boat wave, you'd have 7 to 9 boats, and the only one that has an officer in it is the middle boat, and you're in radio communication with the ship. And they would tell you how you were doing, whether you're on course, off course, on time, or not, because if you get to the beach too soon, there may be naval artillery landing on the beach when you get there, not nice, and the same if you're there a little late. You have a 10-second window to hit the beach. And so they would do this, and then we'd cross this theoretical finish line, which was the beach, and then we'd start again. Well, my boat wave was the last one to finish, and we were proceeding on a lane that they had outlined, which kind of went out of the harbor toward the sea. Each one of these legs is about a mile. And for some reason or other, the communication people aboard the ship thought that we knew that the exercise was over, but nobody ever told us. So they just gave us a course to head, and we just kept going that way, and after about half an hour in these relatively slow craft, we're out way in the open sea taking 6-foot waves, which were never designed to do, and it's getting very hairy, and I'm radioing the ship, wondering what's going on. And it just so happened that after they had what we call secured from the exercise, one of the enlisted men who was a ship's communicator happened to be in the Combat Information Center and hear me radio in and realize that we're miles from the ship, still thinking we're in the exercise. I might still be out there. That was kind of fun. My dad was career military from 1932 through the end of the 50s. And he was sunk twice in the Pacific, at the Battle of the Coral Sea and at the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway changed the entire course of at least half of World War II, the war in the Pacific, in just 5 minutes. In 5 minutes' time, in aerial attacks by our carrier forces against the Imperial Japanese Navy, 4 of their carriers were sunk, and it changed everything. It's the single most dramatic turn of events in military history, really. My dad was part of that, and the interesting thing about it was that he, like I believe so many veterans, didn't want to talk about it. what would drive him crazy would be people who had served and couldn't thump themselves on the back enough and talk about their military services and their sacrifices for the country and expect whatever benefits were next coming to them. He was of the old school who felt that whatever you did out of a sense of duty to your country. It was a privilege to serve, and you would never think about taking credit for it. My dad was the person in charge of a small radio direction finding station in a big pineapple field outside of Honolulu. And when the bombing started early that morning, we lived about 7 or 8 miles out of Honolulu itself. He said to my mother, you know, that's the longest practice session I've ever heard, because at that point he was assuming that it was the fleet off the coast practicing with their big guns. Then the word got through to him of what was going on. So he jumped in a Jeep and took one of his fellow sailors, and they roared over this bumpy road through the pineapple field to their small radio direction finding station to see if they could locate the Japanese fleet. Now there are several movies out, and it's about Pearl Harbor, and there were descriptions about how the brand new radar station that had just been installed, run by the Army, had detected the Japanese attacking waves from the Japanese fleet, but they mistook and thought that they were an arriving flight of B-17s, and then they shut down the radar. My dad's station were able to locate the Japanese fleet, but again, everybody thought, oh, they couldn't be up there, they couldn't be in the north, and so it was pretty much disregarded. This is a story that isn't told, but returning to him in the Jeep, they're roaring at about 50 miles an hour over this bumpy road in the pineapple field, and the guy next to my dad, they used to call him Skip, turns around like this, and he's hanging on for dear life, and he looks back at my dad and he says, "Skip, there's a Jap plane right behind us." And a Zero had throttled back to 50, 60 miles an hour and was hanging in the air right behind them. And he says, "He's flashing his lights at us." Well, it was machine gun fire. But they were so close that the machine gun bullets ran along both sides of the Jeep. And they escaped. So that was an interesting story from the time. A few months later, we had to be evacuated from Hawaii because they were trying to get the military dependents off to make room just for more sailors and airmen and Army people coming in. And we left just at Easter. And I was really mad because they told all of us kids that we were going to get Mickey Mouse gas masks because they were having air raids after the attack on December 7th. Every few days they'd have big air raids, and sometimes we thought they were real. We didn't know. And they had these crude shelters that were scooped out under the wooden porches that were outside our houses. And we lived in a tough Portuguese neighborhood at the time. There were a lot of mean little kids. So they'd have an air raid, and all of us kids would be forced to get in this dugout underneath the porch. And the mean little kids would catch scorpions and spiders. And I'm just 2.5. And they'd put these scorpions and spiders on me, and they would say, "Jim, the Japs are right outside with bayonets. They're going to get you." And I'd be screaming and hollering, and finally I couldn't stand the spiders and the scorpions, so I'd run outside convinced that the Japanese soldiers were right there. But of course, there was nobody there. Anyway, they kept telling us we were going to get our gas masks because the regular gas masks were too big for little kids. And Walt Disney was making some in the States with Mickey Mouse ears on them. And I wanted my Mickey Mouse gas masks in the worst way, and they had just come out, but we came back to the States before I got my Mickey Mouse gas mask. The opportunity to serve in the military is very much a growth experience. One of the most important things I think that happens to people in the military is that they have an opportunity to learn so much more about themselves and to learn about other people, especially in environments of considerable stress. The Navy used to have a recruiting slogan, it's not a job, it's an adventure. And there's a great element of that to it. Certainly it can get boring. Certainly you can get in a military assignment where your superiors are military martinets who probably couldn't make a living as civilians, but who are free to make your life as miserable as can be. But that's not the main spirit of it. That's not what happens day in and day out. The Army has had a recruiting slogan, which they're not using right now, but I thought it was very good and very evocative of the military experience at its best, and that is be all that you can be, because that's kind of what it's about. The lessons you learn, humility you acquire, stays with you absolutely the rest of your life. And there are, I think, a certain degree of poise that young men and women can acquire through that experience that serves them well in any walk of life.